everyone and welcome to our Angular 2 Forms course. I'm Vasco from the Angular University, and in this lesson we are going to start by learning why do we need a full framework module for doing something apparently as simple as forms. Well, the main reason is forms are really not that simple. Forms can be a very complex part of our application, especially if there is a very large amount of fields, if the forms span several tabs, if there are editable parts of the form that can be edited via a dialog. Forms can be very complex. There can be a lot of business validation rules, interdependent validations depending on multiple fields of the form. You could have a whole tab in error. Could have multiple fields that are related in error. Angular 2 helps us deal with all that. It helps us extract the data from the form in a simplified way, so you will never have to write code that gets the data from the form and populates an object. That's done for you. Also, Angular 2 helps us dealing with validating the form, showing proper error messages to the user, clearly identifying which parts of the form need to be edited. That's the big added value of the forms module. Not every form is that complex. Take a look at this example where we are creating a lesson in a course. So we are going to put the title, the duration, and we're going to put the level, either beginning or advanced, and then we click on a button, create lesson. Now, what we want to do in this form is we want to extract the data that the user types in from the form. Let's start with that. That is called data binding. Let's configure this in a template-driven way. This is the closest that you can get in Angular 2 to the Angular 1 way, if you are familiar with Angular 1. If you are not familiar with Angular 1, don't worry, we are going to explain now data binding for this simple form. What we want to do here is we want to synchronize continuously the content of the form. We want to bind it to this lesson object. This lesson object is an instance of the lesson class, which has these properties. Take a look at the type annotations in the constructor. These are actually optional because we are specifying default values for each constructor parameter. So if we remove the type annotations, we still have type safety in this program. This TypeScript feature is known as type inference. In order to use Angular 2 forms, we need to set them up because they are not included by default in Angular. So in this case, we want to use template-driven forms. For that, we need to import, in this case, in our root module, we are going to import the forms module from the Angular/forms barrel. Now, what we want to do in this form before using NgModel is we want to turn off certain HTML5 features that are on by default, because we don't want HTML5 to be handling the validation of the form. We want Angular to do it. For that, we simply use the noValidate property in the form. We also don't need autocomplete, so I'm just going to turn it off. Let's also output the value of the lesson object to the screen using the JSON pipe so that we can see bidirectional binding in action. Now let's configure the title field to be bidirectionally bound to the lesson title property. For that, we are going to use NgModel and we are going to assign it lesson.title. This syntax here with the two parentheses is called the banana box syntax. If we try now this out and we start typing in the title lesson field, we're going to see that the lesson object is automatically kept in sync with the content of the input field with each key-up event. So this is the NgModel functionality in action. We don't need to code anything for doing data binding. It's done for us automatically. But that is only half the story of Angular 2 forms, data binding. Let's inspect the HTML. We have here several state classes: valid, or it could be invalid, touched, pristine. NgModel is also helping us validate this form, and we are going to see exactly how to do validation in the upcoming lessons. So stay tuned. Hello everyone, how's it going? It's Vasco from the Angular University, and in this lesson we're going to learn a couple of different ways of using NgModel. NgModel is not only for bidirectional data binding, there's more to it. So let's take an example. Sometimes we simply just want to initialize a form with certain values that arrived, imagine, from our backend, but we don't want necessarily to keep the value of the form all the time in sync with a certain object. Maybe we want to wait until the whole form is valid before retrieving the data. There could be several reasons. Anyway, NgModel supports that and more. Now, one aside, how do we handle this radio button in Angular 2? We usually want to assign to a radio button, we want to have it associated to a TypeScript enum, in this case the student level, where you have beginner and advanced, the different levels of a lesson. Well, an HTML form does not give us an enum, it gives us a string, simply put, the string that we have specified in the value attribute of the radio button option in the form. How can we deal with this? Since NgModel is continuously reading and writing into the lesson object level property, what we can do is we can use TypeScript's getters and setters to transform the enum back into a string and vice versa, like we're doing here. Now, NgModel works also only for initializing the form. You don't have to use it always for bidirectional binding. If you just want to initialize the form with the content of the lesson object, but don't want to bind to it all the time, you can do so by removing these round brackets from the NgModel attribute declaration. Let's try this out. If we now edit the title and the duration fields, the values are not being reflected back into the lesson object. But if we now edit the student level enum, that is still being bidirectionally bound because we are using the famous banana box syntax for the student level field. But remember, NgModel and Angular 2 forms in general is about data binding and validation. You might not want to do any data binding at all, not even setting an initial value in the form. You might only want to use the validation functionality of forms, and NgModel supports that. If we want to do that, we simply remove the brackets notation from the NgModel attribute. We simply use it like this. Let's try this out. As we can see now, there is no data binding at all being done, not even an initial value. But validation is still working. The validation functionality that sets the CSS state classes like dirty, touched, that is still being applied to this field by NgModel. But okay, what can we do with these classes? We are not displaying any error message to the user. How can we do that? How can we give the user a good form user experience using Angular 2? We're going to find out in the next few lessons. How's it going? It's Vasco from the Angular University. And in this lesson we are going to learn what is this magic all about of template-driven forms. How does this work? We are also going to see some standard validators that come with the framework. So, coming right up. You might be wondering, how does this all work? Well, it's a testament to the power of Angular 2 forms and directives, the mechanisms that we have seen before. All the forms module is made with directives, basically. These are just plain Angular 2 directives. You could have written them yourself, but they come packaged for us already. There is a form level directive that is applied to the form element. So it has a selector which has form in it, and that's basically it. It's as simple as that. So there will be a form directive that keeps track of the validity of the whole form and which form fields, which form controls does the form have. Then whenever you apply NgModel to an input, That will also create a directive that gets applied to that input element. And that directive will create a form control that will also register itself in the form directive. So remember, directives can intercommunicate via different mechanisms. Whenever you apply the required attribute, well, that's also a forms standard directive that gets applied to this element that will register a validation rule with the form control. But enough about the theory, let's see this in practice. So it's very simple. The same way that you have the required directive that gets applied to mark fields in mandatory, there are many other directives that allow us to do form field validation, such as minimum length. For example, let's see how this works. If we specify a minimum length of 10 characters and we start typing on the field will be red until the moment where we type at least 10 characters or more. Let's try another standard validator, the max length validator. So if we say max length 15, we start typing, it becomes valid, and now we cannot type anymore. So this directive mimics the standard behavior of the HTML5 max length validator. Let's try another standard validator. For example, let's say that the duration field can only have numeric characters. Let's use the pattern validator and we can pass it in a JavaScript regular expression that defines what are the acceptable characters for the field. As you can see, you can only type numbers in this field as expected. Now that you know how template-driven forms work under the hood, you can understand that you can add your own validations to a form by creating a directive. We are going to see that in an upcoming course. Also, you know that this is just directives under the hood doing this functionality. This is very useful. You will see in the next lesson how can you use this to disable the form button until the whole form is valid. It's coming right up. Welcome, it's Vasco from the Angular University, and in this lesson we are going to start learning a completely different way of making Angular 2 forms, model-driven or reactive-driven forms. Why do we need two ways of doing forms? What's the difference? When to use each? Is coming right up. So first, let's take the same form that we did in the template-driven forms section. It's just a clean HTML form that you're looking at. We're going to write it in the model-driven way. The main difference towards template-driven forms is that in this case we are going to create the form and its controls programmatically, and then we are going to bind it to form elements, as opposed to using a set of directives to create implicitly behind the scenes the form and its controls for us. But enough about the theory. Let's see this in practice. In order to be able to use reactive forms, the first thing that we need to do is to import the reactive forms module into our application. In this case, we are going to import it into the root module of our demo application. Now let's create the form. Actually, let's use the form group directive to assign to this element an existing form. So we are not creating it in the template. I cannot stress this enough. So in this case, my form is the form associated to this HTML form. All the reactive form directives start with form, so we can see that they make a consistent group. Now, in our controller, let's define a variable myForm, which is of type form group. That represents the form. Now, let's start our program and let's see what happens here. We have not initialized the myForm variable, so we get an error. This is expected. Again, reactive form directives bind form elements to variables that we need to initialize ourselves programmatically. So in this case, we need to initialize myForm and we're going to create a new form group instance. We're going to pass it in for the moment an empty configuration object. Let's try this out again. Now the error is fixed. We have created our first reactive form. Now let's add some controls to the form. Before we were doing that using NgModel. In this case, we are going to use the form control name directive, and we are going to assign to each form control a name like the directive says. Now, let's run this. What will happen? Try to guess. Of course, we get an error, because again, this directive is only binding to an existing control that we need to create ourselves. So, let's do that. Let's create 3 form controls, one for each input field, the title, the duration, and the description. We are going to create the form controls inside the configuration object that was passed on to the form itself. So, each property of this object, each property name, is the name of the control, and the value is the control itself that we're going to create with new form control, and we're going to pass to each control its initial value. Let's try this out. So as you can see, the form controls have been initialized with the initial value, and we have no errors on the console. So congratulations, you have created your first reactive form. Why is it called reactive? What's the point? What's the difference? We're going to start to understand that already in the next lesson, where we are going to go over validation in reactive forms. So stay tuned. Welcome, it's Vasco from the Angular University, and in this lesson we're going to talk about how to do form validation with model-driven or reactive forms. So stay tuned, it's coming right up. We can define the validation rules of our form controls programmatically at the level of the form control. So the second argument that you pass on to the form control constructor is an array containing a list of validators. And validators are just plain functions. So the previous validators that we saw were required, pattern, max length, etc. We can import those validators from the forms module. Let's see, here we are going to import validators.required. There are others, validators.minLength, max length, pattern. All this functionality is available here for configuration. Actually, internally, this code here that performs this validation, this is also called by the set of directives that we have seen before applied directly at the template level, like the required attribute, min length, max length, pattern. Internally, those directives call these validators that we are configuring here. It's the same code. Let's see this in action. If we try this out, we can see that all the validation functionality is working. Mandatory fields are being marked as red if empty, and we can only type numbers into the duration field. So this works just like template-driven forms. But take for example a more complex case where maybe we would like to add a validation to a certain form field, but only in a certain condition, depending on the data. Now that's a more advanced use case that actually happens a lot in practice, and that we would not be able to do with template-driven form validation. Actually, everything in principle that you can do with model-driven forms, you can also do with template-driven forms. But in the case of this example, it would probably be much harder. You are probably still thinking, okay, that's great, but why are they called reactive forms? We're going to go into it in the couple of next lessons, so stay tuned. Hello everyone and welcome, Vasco here from the Angular University, and in this lesson we are going to learn how to initialize a form with a set of existing values that might have come, for example, from the backend. We are also going to learn how to reset a form. And last but not least, we are going to cover a common pitfall that occurs often when we are using model-driven forms. I invite you to keep an eye on the duration field during the course of this lesson. The explanation for what you are about to see is available in the end of this lesson. There are two ways to update a form, either a partial or a complete update. Let's start with a partial update. Let's create here a button that is called partial update. It calls a method that we are going to implement. We are simply going to call the myForm, so we have a reference, a form group. We are going to call the patchValue method, and inside it we are going to pass it in an object. Each of the properties of the object should correspond to a form field. So in this case, we are going to specify the title property and we're going to give it a new value. Note that in the patch value call, we don't need to pass in all the mandatory fields of the form. We can pass in only the fields that we want to modify. Let's try this out. If we now click the button, we can see that the update is working as expected. So again, we passed in here a value that we just hard-coded, but this could have come, for example, from the server. Now, what we want to do is, we might want to do a full update of the form values. So let's add a new button, full update, and let's implement it. We're going to use the method myForm.setValue, and inside we are going to pass in another object. Let's specify, for example, the mandatory property title. Let's try this out to see what happens. So we can see that we receive an error, and the error says that we did not provide the description property. So let's just add the description to the object that we pass into setValue, and let's try it again. Now we don't receive any error and everything is working as expected. I'm sure that you noticed during this lesson that something was wrong concerning the duration field. We're going to explain that. That's the pitfall that we mentioned in the beginning of this lesson. It's very simple. When we called patch value, we passed in a duration property. It did not get applied. When we called set value, we would expect an error if one of the form fields is not available. We didn't pass in a duration, we did not get any error. Take a look, this is because the duration field, although we created it programmatically using new form control and we bound it to this control using the form control directive, that control is isolated, it's not linked to any form. Take a look at the formBuilder.group call, where we pass in the form fields. We can see that only title and description are part of the form, but not duration. So the conclusion is, if you are doing model-driven forms and you are creating controls programmatically and binding them using form control, make sure to also add them to the form declaration. Otherwise, they will not be considered part of the form. Let's now learn how to reset a form. So we have added a third button, reset, that simply calls this method named reset. And inside it we simply call reset on the form. It's as simple as that. Now take a look at this. We start editing the form and we can see that the status of dirty, touched, untouched, etc., the CSS state classes of the form control, they have been updated accordingly. Now, whenever we click the reset button, we can see that not only the form fields have been reset, but also the CSS state classes have been all resetted to their initial values. And so this covers how to set a form value. Now, in the next lesson, we are going to learn when should we use template-driven forms versus model-driven or reactive forms, and why? It's coming right up. Hello everyone and welcome. I'm Vasco from the Angular University, and in this lesson we are going to learn when should we use template-driven versus model-driven or reactive forms, and why. It's coming right up. Let's give an example. For example, this is a model-driven form. So all the validations and all the controls are defined programmatically, and we are just binding those controls to the template using, for example, form control name and the form group directives. Now, what we haven't done so far is that we can actually combine model-driven forms and template-driven forms in the same form. For example, the mandatory validation for the title field. We can delete it here from the programmatic declaration, so it's no longer defined in a model-driven way, but we can go now to the form itself and we can add the required attribute, and this will still work. Let's give it a try. If we clear the title mandatory field, we can see that the validation is triggered. So this proves that we can use both mechanisms of form building together. But you can see, even from this simple example, how things can start becoming confusing rather fast if we mix the two approaches in the same form. So we are best off choosing one approach and using it consistently through the whole application. There might be cases where we need to mix the two approaches, but those tend to be the exception and not the rule. But then, what type of form should we choose and why? That actually depends on the concrete situation. For example, if you are migrating an existing application from Angular 1 to Angular 2, you really want to go with template-driven forms, at least in an early stage. That's one of the main use cases of template-driven forms actually. It makes it very easy to migrate existing Angular 1 forms built using NgModel to Angular 2 forms that also use NgModel and the banana box syntax and bidirectional binding. That's really one of the main use cases. Now, if you have a simple form in an Angular 2 application, it only takes a couple of fields, like 3 or 4 fields, and it only uses very basic validation like these fields are mandatory, this field only has this minimum length. In such a simple use case, you can also use template-driven forms. They work perfectly. There is no reason to not use them. But model-driven forms were built to handle cases where the complexity increases, like for example, enterprise applications. Imagine a very large CRUD application with large forms that span multiple tabs, with a ton of fields, a lot of business logic validation. So for example, certain fields cannot have this combination of values. That's the clear scenario for using model-driven forms from the beginning. Also, if you have an application where you want to add a more modern functionality like autosave or undo redo, you will find it much easier to add that sort of functionality if you use reactive forms from the beginning. And remember, template-driven forms and model-driven forms are using under the hood exactly the same mechanisms. That means that for both you will have a form group representing the form, and you will have form controls representing the individual controls. So under the hood they work exactly the same way. This also means that there is nothing that you can do with template-driven forms that you could not do with model-driven forms, and vice versa. But we can see that certain features are really simple to implement using model-driven forms. Things like autosave, complex interfield validations. Those come much more natural using model-driven forms. I hope this has helped you decide which type of forms to choose for your application. In the next lesson we are going to see both form types in action in the exercise of the forms course.